Police blame stepmom for murder. Until 6-year-old exposes the truth, the Oxley family mystery. The room was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that felt heavy. Detective Harris stood by the window, staring out at the darkened yard. The shadows stretched across the grass, like fingers. A cool breeze stirred, rattling the leaves in the trees. He wasn't sure what had changed, but something had shifted. His eyes flicked over to the young boy sitting on the couch, his legs swinging nervously. 6-year-old Caleb. He'd been so quiet all day. Too quiet for his age. Harris glanced at the mother figure, Laura Oxley. She sat across from him, pale, fidgeting. The tension was thick in the air, like the calm before a storm. Laura had been the prime suspect for days now, but something was off. Caleb's eyes met Harris's, wide and anxious. He bit his lip, almost as if he was holding something back. Harris took a slow step forward. "Caleb," he said softly, "is there something you need to tell me?" The boy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, then slowly nodded. "Go on," Harris coaxed gently. Caleb's voice was barely a whisper. It wasn't her. Harris's heart skipped a beat. He leaned in closer, trying to keep his tone calm. "Who wasn't it, Mom?" "It wasn't my mom." Laura's face froze. She glanced at Caleb, a flicker of panic crossing her features. Harris pressed on. "Who did it, Caleb? Who hurt your dad?" The boy swallowed hard, his small fingers twisting together. "It was the man." Harris's mind raced. "The man? What man?" Caleb looked up, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "The man who came in the night. The man who..." He wore a mask. Harris felt a chill run down his spine. A mask. Everything changed in that moment. This was no accident. No mistake. Laura wasn't the killer. Someone else had been there. Someone hiding in the shadows. The investigation had just taken a dark turn. The truth was finally coming to light, and it was worse than they ever imagined. Harris felt his breath catch. A mask. The words echoed in his head, tumbling over each other. The truth was slipping through his fingers, unraveling before his eyes. Laura's face was pale, her lips trembling. She wasn't making eye contact anymore. Her hands, once nervously fidgeting, were now clenched tightly in her lap. Caleb's voice broke the silence again. "He came in the middle of the night while I was sleeping." Harris's stomach tightened. This was getting worse. "Did you see him, Caleb?" Harris asked, his voice shaky with disbelief. The boy nodded slowly, his eyes wide. He was big, and he had a mask. It was a scary mask. A cold shiver ran through Harris's body. A mask, not a random act. The detective turned toward Laura, his gaze hardening. "Laura," he said, his voice low, "who is this man?" She didn't answer at first. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to Caleb. I don't know," she whispered, barely audible. But Harris could tell she was lying. Her eyes were shifting, and there's something in her expression. Fear, guilt, but not the kind of guilt someone feels when they've committed murder. It was different. Caleb shifted in his seat. He stared at Laura, his eyes full of confusion and hurt. "Mom," he said, his voice small. Laura swallowed hard, her face suddenly twisting. She stood up, her chair scraping across the floor with a sharp screech. I didn't know who he was. I swear." Her voice cracked, the words coming out in a desperate rush. "I didn't want to hurt him, Caleb. I didn't." Harris could see the cracks in her composure. She was unraveling, but something still didn't sit right. The pieces didn't fit. Who was the man Caleb described? And why was Laura so terrified of him? The detective's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. And then, in the dead silence of the room, the phone rang. The sound shattered the stillness, making everyone jump. Harris grabbed it on the second ring, his hands trembling. "This is Detective Harris," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar. "Detective, we have a lead. You need to come down to the old warehouse off Oak Street." Now, Harris's pulse quickened. Oak Street, the place that had been a ghost town for years. Why there? Before he could say another word, the line went dead. He stood frozen for a moment. The room felt even colder. Something bigger was at play here. The man Caleb had seen, and the mysterious phone call. The pieces were falling into place, but they were leading him somewhere dark. A place where no one, not even Harris, was prepared to go. Harris hung up the phone. His heart raced. The warehouse. A lead. He glanced at Laura, her face pale as a ghost. The tension in the room felt suffocating, thick as smoke. Caleb was still staring at his mother, eyes full of confusion. "Mom, what's going on?" he whispered, his voice quivering. Laura didn't respond. Her eyes were glued to the floor, and her breath came in shallow gasps. Harris could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had to move. There was no time to waste. With a final look at Laura, he turned toward the door. "I need to go," he said, his voice low and purposeful. "Don't leave," Laura pleaded, her voice cracking. Harris didn't turn around. His mind was already on the way to Oak Street. The cold night air hit him as he stepped outside, the chill creeping through his jacket. His car was parked in the driveway, headlights cutting through the darkness. He slid into the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel tightly. His thoughts raced. Who was this man Caleb had described? Why had Laura seemed so terrified? What was really going on in that house? The drive to Oak Street felt like an eternity. Every turn, every stoplight, dragged him deeper into the unknown. His headlights flickered over the empty streets, the houses dark and silent. Then, the warehouse appeared ahead, an old, crumbling building on the edge of town. It loomed in the distance, its windows shattered, its walls covered in graffiti. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding. Harris's instincts were on high alert. He parked a few yards away, keeping the car's lights off. Slowly, he got out, moving toward the building with careful steps. The place smelled of rust and decay. The silence was unsettling. Not a single sound could be heard, save for the occasional gust of wind. His breath clouded in front of him as he approached the cracked metal door. He hesitated for a moment, listening. Nothing. Then, without a second thought, he pushed the door open. It creaked, the sound cutting through the still night. Inside, the warehouse was pitch black, save for a single flickering light in the far corner. Harris's hand instinctively went to his gun. He moved quietly, his footsteps echoing off the walls. His eyes darted around the dark space, searching for any sign of life. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a mask. Harris's blood ran cold. The same mask Caleb had described. The man's eyes glinted in the dim light. And then, without warning, he lunged. Harris barely had time to react. The man's strength was overwhelming, knocking him back against a stack of crates. For a moment, Harris struggled to breathe. The figure moved closer, the mask's hollow eyes staring down at him. But then, a sharp, searing pain shot through Harris's side. He gasped, reaching for his wound. The world blurred. Everything spun. The man stood over him, breathing heavily. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the figure vanished back into the shadows. Harris's vision began to fade. His body felt heavier with every passing second. He fought to stay awake, but it was no use. Darkness closed in, and in that silence, the truth remained hidden. The cold floor pressed against Harris's back, a harsh reality he couldn't escape. His vision swam, his pulse sluggish. The pain in his side was unbearable, but his focus remained sharp. He fought to stay conscious, forcing his eyes open. The warehouse was silent again, save for his ragged breathing. He could feel the warmth of his blood soaking through his shirt. The man had disappeared into the shadows, leaving him alone. But Harris wasn't alone. His instincts kicked in. Someone had to know what was happening. Someone had to come. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to move, to crawl, to get to his feet. Every inch of movement sent sharp pain radiating through his body, but he had no choice. He couldn't afford to pass out here. Not now. Not with everything still hanging in the balance. Harris stumbled toward the far corner of the warehouse, his mind fuzzy but determined. His hand reached out, grasping a metal beam for support. The flickering light above him cast erratic shadows, dancing like ghosts. Then, suddenly, a voice. It was low, too calm. "Don't move." Harris froze, his body tensing. The voice was familiar, yet unrecognizable in the moment. He turned slowly, and there, emerging from the shadows, was Laura. Her face was pale, her eyes dark with something unreadable. "Laura," Harris gasped, trying to steady his breathing. She took a step closer, her footsteps unnervingly soft. "You didn't know, did you?" she asked, her voice oddly flat. Harris's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He couldn't understand what she meant. What are you doing here?" he croaked, barely able to speak through the pain. Laura didn't answer. Her eyes lingered on his wound, then slowly lifted to meet his gaze again. "I didn't know you'd come here," she murmured. The words didn't make sense. Harris's mind struggled to catch up. Suddenly, she knelt down beside him, her hands moving with surprising gentleness as she touched his arm. Her breath was steady, calm, almost too calm. "I didn't want you to know the truth, Harris," she whispered. "But now, it's too late." His heart pounded harder. Too late? He couldn't understand. "What do you mean?" he gasped. Laura's lips curled into a thin, sad smile. "The man in the mask," she began, her voice suddenly filled with a hollow regret, "wasn't just anyone. He was someone we both knew." A jolt of recognition hit him, like a freight train. His mind reeled. Not just anyone. Who? And then, like a switch being flipped, the pieces clicked together. The mask, the shadows, the sudden, terrible realization. Laura hadn't been the killer, but she had been part of it. Her connection to the man in the mask ran deeper than Harris had ever suspected. It wasn't just a random act. It was planned. Laura, kneeling beside him, let out a sigh. "I'm sorry, Harris. I never wanted it to end this way." The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. And then, just as quickly, it all made sense. The man in the mask, the phone call, the quiet, unsettling moments with Caleb. It was all part of a bigger picture, one that had been hidden in plain sight. Harris tried to speak, but his words came out as nothing more than a rasping whisper. Before he could gather the strength to say anything else, Laura stood up. She stepped back into the shadows, leaving him on the floor, alone and bleeding. The last thing Harris heard, before everything faded into darkness, was her voice, soft but final. "It's over now." And then there was nothing, just the silence of the warehouse. Harris's world slipped further into darkness, the edges of his consciousness blurring into a faint haze. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one harder than the last. He tried to call out, but no words came. The pain in his side felt like it was swallowing him whole, and his vision flickered in and out. For a brief, disorienting moment, he thought he could hear something. Footsteps, but they were distant, muffled, as though they were coming from far away. He couldn't tell if it was real or just a hallucination. Everything felt wrong, cold, empty. He fought to stay awake, but his body was betraying him. The warehouse around him seemed to stretch and shift, the shadows moving in unnatural ways. Then The sound came again, this time louder, closer. His heart jolted in his chest, and he forced his eyes open, searching the dim room. A shape emerged from the darkness, a figure moving with purpose. Harris's breath caught. The man in the mask. He could barely make out the outline, but there was no mistaking it. The mask was unmistakable, its hollow eyes staring back at him. The figure stepped forward, closer now, moving like a shadow. Harris's mind scrambled for clarity, but it was slipping away like water through his fingers. He couldn't stop him. He was too weak. The masked figure loomed over him, silent and still. Then something unexpected happened. A voice, soft but insistent, broke through the heavy silence. Don't let him. It was Caleb's voice, barely a whisper, but it cut through the air. Harris blinked, struggling to focus. The boy. How was he here? The masked figure didn't seem to notice the child's presence. He leaned down, his cold breath brushing against Harris's ear. "Your time's up," the figure whispered, the words almost like a promise. But before Harris could react, a sharp, high-pitched cry cut through the air. It was Caleb, a small, desperate scream. The masked figure's head snapped toward the sound, startled. For just a moment, Harris saw a flicker of something uncertainty in the figure's eyes. Caleb was running toward them, his small body trembling, but determined. "Get away from him!" the boy shouted, his voice breaking with fear. Harris's heart stuttered. Caleb was here. He couldn't understand how, but the child was standing firm. The figure hesitated, his body still and tense. Then, with a sudden, fluid motion, he turned away, slipping back into the shadows as if he had never been there. The warehouse felt colder now, the room even darker. Harris felt his chest tighten, his body shaking with what little strength he had left. The boy stood over him, tears streaming down his face, but his expression was fierce, resolute. "Don't go to sleep, detective," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have to stay awake." Harris struggled to lift his head, his mind spinning, his vision swimming. The boy's words barely registered, but somehow they broke through the fog. Stay awake. He clung to that, reaching for it like a lifeline. Caleb's small hands gripped his arm, his touch surprisingly strong. "Help's coming," the boy said, though Harris wasn't sure if he meant it or if it was just a desperate hope. But Caleb's presence grounded him in a way that nothing else could. The pain, the darkness, it all began to blur. His eyelids fluttered, the world slipping away until the screech of tires on gravel, the distant wail of sirens. Finally, the cavalry had arrived. Everything went black. When Harris woke, he was no longer in the warehouse. His body was warm. There was the steady, reassuring beeping of machines nearby. He groggily opened his eyes. The sterile white walls of a hospital room greeted him. He could hear voices muffled, drifting in and out of his consciousness. His body felt heavy, his wounds stitched up, but the memories, the pieces of the puzzle still clung to him, sharp and painful. Then a familiar face appeared. Detective Carter, his colleague. "Hey," Carter said softly, his voice filled with relief. Harris tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Carter took a step closer, his expression serious. "We got him," he said, and Harris's heart skipped a beat. "The man in the mask," Harris rasped. "Yeah, we found him. He was hiding in an old storage unit just a few miles from the warehouse." Harris felt a wave of exhaustion, but he pressed on. "Laura," he whispered, barely able to manage the word. Carter's eyes shifted, his face tightening. "She's gone, Harris." "She what?" Harris's mind whirled. "She disappeared, vanished. We couldn't find her. We think she was part of it all along." The truth, like a veil being torn away, finally became clear. Laura had been more than just a witness. She had been tangled in the web of lies and deceit, protecting the man behind the mask. But why? And who else was involved? There were still too many unanswered questions. The investigation wasn't over. But as Harris closed his eyes again, his body sinking into the comfort of rest, one thing was certain. The truth was out there, and now it was just a matter of time before it all came to light. Harris drifted in and out of sleep, his mind racing. The weight of everything was too much to process all at once. The face of the man in the mask lingered behind his eyelids, dark and haunting. But then there was Caleb. The boy had been there in the warehouse, saving him in a way that didn't make sense. How had he known? Why had Caleb been so calm in the face of danger? A small knock at the door pulled him from his restless thoughts. Detective Carter stepped in, a folder in his hands. His face was grim, eyes tired. Harris blinked slowly, trying to focus. "Got something?" Carter said, his voice heavy. He dropped the folder on the bed beside Harris, his hands folding behind his back. Harris squinted at the folder, confusion setting in. "What is it?" he rasped. Carter looked down, clearly reluctant. "It's Caleb," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Harris's heart skipped. "Caleb," he repeated, his mind foggy with disbelief. "Yeah." Carter paused, then spoke with slow deliberation. "We've been going over his statements. His behavior, it's all a little off." "What do you mean?" Harris asked, struggling to sit up. Carter hesitated, glancing at the door as if to ensure no one else was listening. "We had a chance to speak with the boy's real father," he began, voice low. "And that's when things started to unravel." Harris's pulse quickened. "The father?" "Yeah. Turns out Caleb's father isn't who he says he is. Or at least, he wasn't always. He used a different name. A different identity. And it goes way back, all the way to the last few years of Laura's marriage." Harris's brow furrowed. "Wait, you're telling me Caleb's father is involved in all this?" Carter nodded slowly. "Not just involved," he continued, his eyes darkening. "He's been involved for years, and he's been hiding in plain sight. We have evidence now that Caleb's father, the man who raised him, is the same person who's been behind the mask." The room seemed to spin. Harris leaned back, his hand pressing against his forehead as the pieces started to fit together, though the picture was far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. Caleb wasn't just a frightened child. He was part of something much darker. "You're saying Caleb's father was the one who killed." Harris stopped, the words sticking in his throat. "Not killed," Carter corrected quickly. "He was hired. We're working on piecing that part together. But it seems like the whole thing was orchestrated from the inside. Caleb's father was using Laura, manipulating her, and when the time came, he sent her to that warehouse. He was always watching." A sickening realization flooded Harris's chest. Caleb knew. Caleb knew about the plan. He knew about his father's involvement. He's been playing us from the start. Carter's face was unreadable. "That's what we think." The boy's behavior was too controlled for a 6-year-old. His reactions, his ability to withhold details, even his response when you were injured, he showed signs of having been coached. He knew exactly what to say. Harris swallowed hard. So Caleb was a pawn, a tool in his father's plan. Exactly. He knew the truth, even when no one else did. Harris sat in stunned silence, processing what Carter had just revealed. Everything he'd believed was now in question. The case, the family, the secrets. They were all tangled together in ways he hadn't even considered. A small voice in his mind whispered again, Caleb's words from the warehouse. "You have to stay awake." The boy had known, but why hadn't he warned him? Why had Caleb waited until the last moment to act? Harris was too tired to figure it out right now, but he knew one thing for sure. Laura hadn't been the mastermind. She had been another victim in the game, a piece to be moved around. And Caleb? Caleb was the key to everything. The boy's dark connection to the man in the mask ran deeper than anyone could have imagined, and that connection was only the beginning. Harris's mind was swirling with possibilities. He had to see Caleb again. He had to know how far this twisted game reached. His instinct screamed at him to go after the boy, to make sense of it all, before it was too late. But as Harris tried to sit up, the room spun again. The weight of everything, all at once, dragged him back down into the hospital bed. "Take it easy," Carter warned, his voice filled with concern. But Harris didn't care about resting anymore. There was a truth out there, and he was going to find it, one way or another. "Get me back to the station," Harris demanded, his voice hoarse but determined. Carter hesitated, then nodded. "I'll make the arrangements, but you need rest." "I need answers," Harris said, his voice growing stronger. Carter's eyes were grave. "You'll get them. But you're not alone in this anymore. We'll get to the bottom of it." But as Harris watched his partner leave the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all still being watched. By someone much closer than they realized. Someone who knew every step they would take before they even made it. The game wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Harris lay back against the hospital bed, but sleep was a distant, impossible thing. His mind churned, replaying every moment, every word Caleb had said, every look, every small detail that had seemed off at the time. Now it all made sense, but it didn't make it any easier to understand. The boy, so young, so innocent on the surface, was tangled in a world of manipulation, deceit, and violence that no child should ever know. And Caleb's father, asterisk the man in the mask asterisk, had orchestrated it all. But why? What did he want? Harris's thoughts twisted like a knot. The pieces were there, but they didn't form a picture that made sense. He glanced at the door as it opened softly. Detective Carter stepped in again, this time with a file in his hands. "You look like you're going through it," Carter said, his voice soft but firm. Harris didn't respond. Instead, his eyes drifted to the file. "More bad news?" Harris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Carter nodded, dropping the folder on the bedside table. "Not bad news, but unsettling. It's about Caleb's father. We got a hit on his old identity, and it's not just anyone, Harris. It's someone who's been on our radar for years." Harris's pulse quickened. "Who?" he asked, sitting up a little straighter despite the lingering pain in his side. Carter's jaw tightened. "His real name is Isaac Ross. He was part of an underground network years ago. We had a few cases linked to him, but they were cold. Dead ends. Everyone thought he vanished." "Underground network?" Harris asked, frowning. Carter nodded. "Human trafficking. Money laundering. The works. We thought he was long gone. But it seems like he's been lying low, building a new life, and using his son as a pawn." Harris's mind reeled. So he faked his own death, started a family, and then brought his son into all this? For what? Power? Control? "That's what we're trying to figure out," Carter replied, pacing slowly. "Where is Caleb now?" Harris asked, his voice a little sharper than he intended. Carter's gaze softened. "That's the thing," he said quietly. "Caleb's been taken." The words hit Harris like a punch to the gut. "Taken? By who?" he whispered. Carter's face grew darker. "We think Ross is using him as leverage to get to the people he's been working with or to get out of the country. We don't know yet, but Caleb's here, right?" Harris demanded. "He's not in danger?" Carter shook his head. "We lost track of him a few hours ago. Someone must have been watching the hospital. We don't know if it was Ross himself or someone else working for him." Harris's thoughts scrambled, his mind flashing back to the moment when Caleb had told him to stay awake. Was it a warning, or was it a calculated move on the boy's part? Either way, something was wrong. "Did you tell his mother?" Harris asked, his voice almost mechanical. Carter paused, clearly struggling with the answer. Laura's not exactly in a position to help right now, Harris. Harris stared at him, confused. What do you mean? She's his mother. She can... No. Carter interrupted, his voice low and firm. Laura was involved in this. She's not the victim we thought she was. We've got evidence that she helped Ross in more ways than one. She knew about the trafficking. She knew about everything, and she kept quiet. Harris's chest tightened, his breath catching. She was never just a pawn, he asked, the disbelief heavy in his voice. Carter shook his head, his face hardening. No, she's part of it. She's been playing us from the start. A sick feeling rose in Harris's stomach. He had never fully trusted Laura, but he hadn't wanted to believe she could be involved, not like this. Where is she now? Harris asked, his voice thick. She disappeared shortly after you were attacked, Carter replied, his eyes narrowed. We've got units looking for her, but she's gone dark. We think she may be working with Ross, or helping him escape. The reality hit Harris like a ton of bricks. Laura had been part of the web all along, and Caleb was just the key. But what did Isaac Ross want with him? And why had he let the boy speak out when he had the chance? Everything was spiraling out of control, faster than he could keep up with. How do we find them? Harris asked, his voice quieter now. Carter was silent for a long moment. I'm not sure, he admitted. But we'll find Ross. We'll find Caleb. But Harris knew. He had a sinking feeling that time was running out, and they were all playing a dangerous game. He wasn't just fighting for the truth anymore. He was fighting for survival, theirs and his own. The final piece was still out there, and until they found it, everything they thought they knew could crumble in an instant. The room felt suffocating, and Harris could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. Each second seemed to stretch, time slipping away like sand through his fingers. Carter's words echoed in his mind, but the more he tried to focus on them, the more they scattered like broken shards of glass. Find Ross. Find Caleb. But where to begin? Harris's instincts were sharp, honed through years of chasing criminals, but this felt different. Ross wasn't just some thug or petty criminal. He was methodical, cunning, and his game was bigger than anything Harris had faced. The boy, Caleb, had been part of the plan from the start, a pawn, a tool. But had he known the full extent of his father's actions? Or had he simply been used, just like Laura? Harris's eyes shifted back to the file Carter had brought in, his gaze lingering on the black and white photos inside. A few images stood out. A younger Isaac Ross, posing in a group of men, their faces set in hard lines. A series of blurry photographs from surveillance cameras showing Caleb with a stranger in an alleyway just days before the attack. And then, something that made Harris's stomach turn. A photograph of Laura, talking to Isaac Ross in a dimly lit bar. The evidence was damning. There was no denying it now. She had been part of this from the beginning. But why? Was it love? Fear? Or was there something more twisted behind her actions? Is she still a threat? Harris asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. Carter's expression darkened. She's always been a threat, he replied quietly. But now she's dangerous. If she's working with Ross, she knows how to play the game. She'll be harder to track than we thought. Harris nodded, his fingers instinctively tapping the bed frame. He needed answers, and time was running out. He glanced at the window. The sky was growing darker outside, the cold evening creeping into the hospital room. There was a sudden shift in the air, something that made his pulse quicken. A noise. Footsteps. But they were not Carter's.
Harris's eyes snapped toward the door. A figure appeared in the doorway. A woman. A shadow. It was Laura. Harris's breath caught. She looked different, more disheveled than he remembered. Her hair was loose, wild around her face, and her clothes were wrinkled, stained with something dark. Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. Laura, Harris murmured, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. She stepped inside the room, her gaze never leaving his. I knew you'd be awake, she said, her voice low, almost hushed. You shouldn't be here, Harris replied, his voice hardening. I needed to see you, she whispered, stepping closer. Carter immediately moved to intervene, but Harris raised a hand, signaling for him to stay back. His heart pounded in his chest, a cocktail of emotions swirling. Was this a trap? Or was she here to confess? I don't want to be a part of this anymore, Laura said, her voice barely audible now, as if she were confessing something deeper than just her involvement. Harris couldn't quite read her. You've been part of it from the beginning, he said, his voice cold. Yes, Laura admitted, her voice trembling. But you have to understand, I didn't know everything. I didn't know he would go this far. The room fell silent. Harris's mind whirled. He? Who? He asked, his voice steady but urgent. Laura's eyes darted to Carter, then back to Harris. I didn't know he was planning to hurt anyone, not at first, she said, her hands wringing in front of her. But then he told me. He told me everything. I thought it was too late. I was trapped. Who are you talking about? Harris pressed, his voice sharp. Isaac, she said, her voice breaking on the name. I didn't know who he really was when I met him, but when I found out, when I saw it all, it was too late. Harris's thoughts raced. Isaac Ross. He had known. She had known. They had both known. But she was telling him this now? After everything? Why come now? Harris demanded. Why confess after everything that's happened? Laura's face twisted with anguish. I couldn't live with it anymore. The lies. The fear. The guilt. But Caleb, I'm scared for him. He's in danger. Isaac won't stop until he's finished. Harris sat up straighter. Where is he? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, she said, her hands trembling. He's already gone into hiding. Isaac has people everywhere, watching. I'm scared, Harris. He's going to use Caleb to get what he wants. Harris's mind clicked into overdrive. Caleb wasn't just a pawn. He was the target. Isaac was using him as leverage for something bigger, something more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Do you know where they're going? Harris asked, his voice hardening. Laura shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. I don't know, but I can help you. I have to. I have to make it right. Harris's mind raced. Trusting Laura was dangerous, but she was his only lead. He couldn't afford to waste time. You're going to help me find Isaac Ross, Harris said, his voice low and commanding. Laura nodded quickly, desperation in her eyes. But Harris knew one thing for certain now. He couldn't trust her. Not fully. Not yet. Isaac Ross was still out there. And if Caleb was going to survive, Harris would need to get to him first. But who would make it out alive in this game? That Harris couldn't say. Not yet. Not until he uncovered the truth. Harris's eyes narrowed, every instinct in him screaming that he couldn't trust Laura. Her sudden appearance, her tear-filled eyes, it felt rehearsed. Too many questions. Too many inconsistencies. And yet, she was the only one who could potentially lead him to Isaac Ross. Caleb's life hung in the balance, and time was slipping away. Laura stepped closer, almost trembling, as if reading his doubt. You have to believe me, she whispered, desperation thick in her voice. Harris kept his gaze fixed on her, weighing her every word. I'll believe you when you show me where they are, he said, his voice cold and steady. Laura hesitated. Her eyes flickered, like she was trying to decide whether to go through with it. But then something shifted. She sighed deeply and pulled something from the pocket of her coat. A small, crumpled piece of paper. She unfolded it slowly and placed it on the bed. Harris took it cautiously, his hands trembling with the weight of the moment. The paper was a map, a hand-drawn diagram showing a series of routes, alleyways, and coordinates that meant nothing to him. Yet everything. Where is this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Laura nodded grimly. I don't know exactly. But Isaac was planning something. He mentioned moving through these routes. The last time I saw him, He was headed to a place on this map. Harris's heart skipped. Where? An old factory on the outskirts of town, Laura said. But it's not just any factory. It's where Isaac hid out for years before disappearing. He's been using it as a base, a place to meet with his contacts. I'm sure they're there now. Harris's breath caught. This was it. The lead he had been waiting for. But something gnawed at him. Something was still off. He stood abruptly, causing a sharp pain to shoot through his side, but he ignored it. We're going there, Harris said, his voice tight with urgency. Carter appeared at the door, hearing the movement. Are you sure you're up for this? He asked, his tone skeptical. I don't have time to sit around, Carter, Harris replied, his gaze hardening. We have to go now. Isaac Ross is Caleb, and I'm not going to wait another second. Laura's eyes flickered nervously, but she nodded. I'll show you the way, she said, voice trembling but resolute. Harris glanced back at her. If you're lying, if this is some kind of trick. It's not a trick, she interrupted, her eyes pleading. I swear, I just want to fix this. The words hung in the air. Harris wasn't sure if he could trust her, but he didn't have a choice. He had to go. Now. Carter's eyes met his, a silent agreement passing between them. We'll need backup, Carter said, pulling out his phone. I'll make the call, Harris said. Just stay close. The night was heavy with a sense of foreboding as they drove through the dark streets. The city sprawled out beneath them like a labyrinth of concrete and steel. Laura sat in the back seat, silent, her eyes constantly shifting as if she were expecting someone, or something, to leap from the shadows. Harris's hand tightened around the wheel, his knuckles white. His mind raced. What was Isaac Ross planning? Why had he taken Caleb? Was this all about power, or was there something deeper at play? The old factory was on the outskirts of the city, its silhouette looming ahead as they pulled up, the flickering lights of a distant street lamp casting long shadows across the dilapidated structure. The building was massive, its windows boarded up, the doors rusted with age. A sense of dread washed over Harris. This is it, Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. You're running out of time, Ross continued, his voice eerie and calm. And Caleb? He's not the only piece in this game. You're about to find out how deep this goes. Harris froze, a chill running down his spine. What did he mean? The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows creeping closer. Caleb's terrified face flickered through his mind. The boy was still alive. That was the one thing Harris could hold on to. But for how long? Harris motioned for Carter to move, both of them slipping into the shadows, trying to keep their movements quiet, controlled. Every step felt like a betrayal of the seconds that slipped away. Another figure appeared, this one moving swiftly across the factory floor, a blur of motion in the dim light. Watch out. Carter shouted. Too late. A shot rang out, and Harris ducked, his heart leaping into his throat as the sound of metal meeting concrete filled the air. The bullet missed, but it was a warning. Harris barely had time to react before a voice boomed through the factory. Enough. Isaac Ross emerged from the shadows, standing tall with Caleb still clutched in his arms. You're too slow, Ross spat. You thought you could save him? You thought you could stop me? Harris's eyes locked on Caleb, the boy's wide, fearful gaze meeting his for a fleeting second. And then, before he could move, Ross yanked Caleb's arm, pulling him closer, positioning him between himself and Harris. You're not going to get him, Ross sneered, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Not now, not ever. The factory fell silent, the air thick with tension, the clock ticking down. Harris's mind raced, every option seeming hopeless, every escape route blocked. He couldn't back down now. Let him go, Ross, Harris demanded, his voice low but resolute. Ross only smirked. This is the endgame, detective. You're too late. But Harris's eyes were fixed on Caleb, and for the first time, something flickered behind the boy's gaze. A shift. A sudden understanding. In that brief moment, Harris realized the truth. Caleb wasn't just a victim. He was part of the final play. And now, it was his turn to make a move. The The tension in the factory was suffocating, like a blanket pressing down on Harris's chest. Isaac Ross's voice still echoed in the air, but it was Caleb's eyes that held Harris's attention now. The boy's gaze was no longer filled with the same unrelenting fear. It was sharper, more knowing, as if he had seen the pieces move and understood the game. Harris's heart skipped. Caleb knew something. Ross might have been the one holding the cards, but something was shifting. Harris could see it in the boy's expression. A flicker of defiance. A hint of something that wasn't just terror. Harris didn't look away. "Caleb," he said softly, his voice urgent but controlled. "Listen to me. You don't have to do this. You can get away from him." The boy's lips trembled, but his eyes seemed to hold something more. Something dangerous. Isaac Ross's grip tightened around Caleb's arm. "Enough." Ross snapped, his voice laced with fury. "You think I'm going to let you sway him with your sweet talk, Harris? You're wasting your time. He's already mine." But Caleb's eyes never left Harris. And for a brief, fleeting second, Harris thought he saw a silent plea in them. "Help me." Harris's mind raced. What was happening? He had known from the start that this case was murky, that there were things hidden beneath the surface. But Caleb, was he the puppet or the puppeteer? Ross had been manipulating him, surely, but there was something deeper at play. "Put the gun down, Ross," Harris said, his voice a little louder this time, stronger. "It's over. You've been playing a dangerous game, but the board's changed. You're out of moves." Ross's smirk wavered, but only for a moment. "Do you really think you can stop me? Do you really think I'd be here if I didn't have a way out?" Harris's pulse pounded in his ears, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. The factory was a maze of metal beams and crumbling walls, shadows stretching long and dark, but he couldn't let that disorient him now. He had one shot. And it wasn't just about Caleb anymore. It was about stopping Isaac Ross from disappearing once again into the abyss. The boy was the key. Harris stepped forward slowly, inching closer to Caleb and Ross, trying to make himself a target. "Let him go, Isaac," he said, his voice steady. "You've taken everything you can. You've manipulated people, hurt them. But Caleb's not your pawn anymore. He's not your insurance." Ross's eyes flickered for just a moment, only for a second. But it was enough. That tiny moment of doubt. And it was all Harris needed. He lunged. Without thinking, without waiting for anything else, Harris moved, fast and desperate. He tackled Ross, knocking the man off balance, sending him stumbling backward. The gun went flying, clattering to the floor, its deadly potential vanishing in an instant. But Ross was a fighter. He fought back with the ferocity of a cornered animal, his fists striking out in a blur of violent rage. Harris dodged one blow, then another, his breath coming in ragged gasps as they grappled on the factory floor. Ross snarled, a low growl of anger building in his chest. "You think you've won?" he spat, his eyes wild with rage. "This isn't over. You'll never stop me." But Harris didn't give up. He couldn't. Not now. Not when Caleb was just inches away, trapped in this hell. Harris landed a punch, sending Ross stumbling back. Ross fell to the floor, his hands scrambling for anything to defend himself, but Harris was already on him, pinning him down. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on Harris's chest, but there was no room for hesitation. He needed to end this, to make sure Ross wouldn't escape again. But just as he was about to secure the cuffs, a voice rang out. "Stop." It was Caleb. The boy's voice was a sharp, desperate cry that froze Harris in his tracks. Harris turned, his heart hammering in his chest. Caleb was standing, but not in fear. His posture was different now, resolute. Harris's blood ran cold. "Caleb, what?" But before he could finish, the boy's hand reached into his jacket pocket. A glint of metal caught the dim light. Harris's eyes widened. "No," he shouted, trying to move, but it was too late. Caleb raised the gun, pointing it directly at Harris. Everything inside him screamed. But there was no time for action.
Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger, and then the shot rang out. But it wasn't aimed at Harris. The bullet flew past him, hitting the ground with a deafening thud. Harris turned in shock, his heart racing as he looked back at Caleb. The boy's hands were shaking, but his eyes were steady. The gun had slipped from his grasp, now lying in a heap on the floor. And for a brief, heart-stopping moment, everything was still. Harris's breath caught, and then he understood. Caleb had never been the puppet. He had been the one pulling the strings all along. But even now, in the face of everything, the boy wasn't ready to pull the final trigger. Not yet. Ross's eyes widened, realization dawning in the space between them. "You're playing me," he hissed, fury building once again. Caleb didn't answer. Instead, he turned his eyes on Harris, his gaze silent, but full of something new, understanding. The game had changed, and now the truth was finally out. The factory was still, save for the distant hum of sirens in the distance, growing louder as they neared. Harris stood there, frozen in place, watching Caleb. The boy was no longer the terrified child he had met at the start of this nightmare. No, he had become something else, something dangerous. Harris's heart pounded in his chest as he processed the events in a haze of confusion and disbelief. Caleb had just taken the life of Isaac Ross. The boy had pulled the trigger, and yet there was no sign of regret on his face, only a chilling emptiness. The boy didn't even flinch as he stared down at Ross's lifeless body, a cold, distant look in his eyes, as if this was just another step in a game he had been playing all along. Harris swallowed hard, his mind struggling to reconcile what he had just witnessed. How had it all come to this? How had the boy, whom he thought to be an innocent victim, become the executioner? "Caleb," Harris whispered, his voice shaky. Why did you do it?" The boy's gaze shifted slowly to Harris, and for a brief moment there was something in his eyes. Something human, something almost vulnerable. "I had no choice," Caleb said quietly, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Harris's breath caught in his throat. "No choice? Caleb, you didn't have to." But the boy cut him off. "You don't understand," Caleb replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was never the victim. I've been playing this game from the start. You were all just pieces." Harris stepped back, his mind struggling to wrap itself around the implications of the boy's words. The pieces. They were all pieces. The puzzle had been so carefully constructed from the beginning. Every move, every decision, every twist and turn. Harris had thought he was chasing the truth, but the truth had been right in front of him all along. Caleb had known. Caleb had always known. Ross, Isaac Ross, the manipulative mastermind behind everything, had underestimated the boy. He had underestimated Caleb's potential to control the game, to turn it all around. Harris felt a chill settle deep into his bones. This wasn't just about Caleb escaping Ross. This was about Caleb taking his place. The boy had learned from Ross. He had absorbed it all, the manipulation, the control, the violence. And now he was the one in control. Harris looked at Caleb again, his gaze heavy with a mixture of horror and sympathy. "You didn't have to do this," Harris said, his voice cracking under the weight of his words. Caleb's expression didn't change. "Yes, I did," the boy replied, his tone cold, matter-of-fact. "He was always going to keep using me. Using everyone. I had to end it. I had to make sure no one else got hurt." Harris shook his head, his mind racing. This was so wrong. Caleb was just a child who had been manipulated, yes, but also one who had now crossed a line that was impossible to come back from. "Caleb," Harris began, his voice trembling, "you can still make things right. You don't have to be like him." But Caleb simply stared at him, his gaze distant. "I already made my choice," the boy said, his voice flat and unwavering. "I'm done playing the victim. I'm done being controlled." The sirens were growing louder now, the sound of approaching police vehicles cutting through the thick silence. But Harris didn't feel relief. Not yet. Not with Caleb standing there, a cold, calculating figure in front of him. This wasn't over. The police would take Isaac Ross's body. They would investigate the scene. They would question Harris, question the circumstances. But the truth, asterisk the real truth asterisk, would be buried. Caleb had won. He had outsmarted them all. And now it was clear. He wasn't just a survivor of this twisted game. He had become the architect of it. The sirens grew louder. The police were almost there. But Harris couldn't take his eyes off Caleb. And Caleb didn't look away either. The boy didn't need to speak anymore. The silence between them was deafening. The game was over. But Harris had a sinking feeling in his stomach. This was only the beginning. And as the first police officers entered the factory, guns drawn, the full weight of what had just happened began to settle in. Caleb wasn't just another victim. He was the one pulling the strings now. And whatever came next, Harris wasn't sure anyone could stop it. Not even him. The factory was alive with the sounds of approaching sirens. But for Harris, time had slowed to a crawl. He couldn't take his eyes off Caleb. The boy's face was almost unreadable now. Too calm, too detached. The chaos, the violence. It seemed like it all faded around Caleb, leaving only a cold, empty silence. Isaac Ross lay motionless on the cold concrete floor, the life drained from his body. And yet, in the midst of this horror, Caleb stood unshaken, as if this was all part of the plan. Harris's heart thudded painfully in his chest. This wasn't the child he had thought he'd been protecting. This wasn't the boy he had promised to save. No, this isn't you, Harris whispered, more to himself than to Caleb. But Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't react. You don't get it, do you? Caleb said, his voice soft but firm. I've been living this game for so long, I know how it works. You try to fight, you try to escape. But in the end, the ones who win are the ones who control it. Harris took a step forward, his instinct screaming at him to reach out, to do something, anything. Caleb, this isn't control. It's not the way out, Harris said, his voice cracking. You've got a choice. You can stop this now. You can walk away from all of this. Caleb's eyes darkened, a coldness there that made Harris's blood run cold. I've already walked away, Detective, Caleb said, his words slow and deliberate. I'm not a victim anymore. I'm not anyone's pawn. I'm the one making the moves now. The words hit Harris like a physical blow. The boy had already made his decision.